and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. Military cooperation between North Korea and Russia will be taken to the next level if the summit between Kim Jong-un and Putin takes place. Russia has also proposed holding trilateral naval exercises with China and North Korea. Will Russia transfer advanced military technology to North Korea? To what extent will China join the coalition? Today we discuss these questions with former senior officials.
Will pay a price for this in the international community. We have also imposed sanctions, specific targeted sanctions, to try to disrupt any effort to use North Korea as a conduit.
국제사회의 평화, 안정을 해하는 북한과의 군사 협력은 이루어져서는 안 될 것입니다.
In the studio with me, Ambassador James Jeffrey, chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Ambassador Jeffrey was the special representative for Syria engagement and the special envoy for the global coalition to defeat ISIS. Ambassador Jeffrey also served as the Deputy National Security Advisor during the George W. Bush administration. He was also the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and to Albania. Also joining us, Mr. Elbridge Colby, co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a Washington-based policy initiative. Mr. Colby served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 to 2018. He is the author of The Strategy of Denial. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, Ambassador Jeffrey, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un reportedly will travel to the Russian Far East to Vladivostok to meet with President Putin to discuss military cooperation. When they meet, what will Kim and Putin exchange with each other?
First, thanks for having me on. This is a dramatic development among the many we have seen in the last 18 months, and it all flows from the Ukraine conflict and the globalization of it, and that is one element of it. Putin needs conventional military weaponry, artillery shells, rockets, that kind of thing, because he's running low. On the other hand, obviously the North Korean leader is going to want more assistance, particularly in his nuclear and ICBM programs, but also less restraint on his bad behavior, because Russia and China, to some degree, have restrained North Korea in the past. And that's the real risk for the United States and our friends in the region, beginning with South Korea.
Mr. Colby, U.S. government says the arms deals between North Korea and Russia are rapidly advancing. And for the United States and South Korea, what is worrisome is the possibility, which Ambassador Jeffrey just mentioned, of passing over ICBM and nuclear technology to North Korea. Is there a real chance that Russia may transfer these sensitive technology to North Korea?
Well, thanks. Great to be here. I think there's a chance. I think ICBM and nuclear weapons-related technology in particular would be the most extreme version of Russian support. But I agree with Ambassador Jeffrey that what we're seeing is a fundamental alignment between not only Russia and North Korea, but increasingly China, Iran, and potentially others. And so I think we should expect to see considerable forward movement in the way of collaboration between North Korea and Russia.
So, Ambassador Jeffrey, if Russia decides to transfer those sensitive technology of satellite and nuclear-powered submarine to North Korea, is there any way the United States can deter such transfer?
I don't think we can stop such transfer. What we can do is respond in ways that will reassure confidence in America's enduring deterrence in South Korea, in Japan, and elsewhere in East Asia. We've taken huge steps in that direction already, particularly with the trilateral summit last month, but we'll have to do more, such as, again, the recent visit of a strategic nuclear-armed submarine to South Korea. So there will be some escalation in response. There's no way we can ignore this.
So if the United States cannot stop the transfer, then it is a big win for North Korea that Russia is struggling in Ukraine.
It is a big win for North Korea in the short run. In the long run, bad news for Russia is bad news for North Korea and bad news for China in the world we're increasingly in today. So therefore, we're helping the people of South Korea and the people of Taiwan with every weapon we're sending to Ukraine, frankly. This is now two fronts beginning to resemble both the Korean War and the Cold War more generally.
Mr. Colby, although Russia and North Korea appear to be deepening their ties, some critics say that their relations cannot go beyond just arms deals. Do you agree?
No, I don't agree with that. I mean, I think what we're seeing is a bifurcation of the international system, of which the Ukraine war is a very significant part, but it's also defined probably more than anything else by Sino-American rivalry. And so, I mean, that dynamic is sort of a godsend, to use an ironic term, for countries like North Korea that were really pretty isolated, because now they have a strong alignment of interest with countries like Beijing and Moscow. So I think we should expect it to move forward. I think I agree with Jim that there are maybe some things we can do on the edge, but fundamentally, if they think their interests are sufficiently served, Pyongyang and Moscow, I think they'll move forward. And given that Moscow at this point basically regards itself as being in conflict with the broader West, it's hard for me to see what the constraints are. I mean, and similarly with North Korea, I'm more skeptical. I mean, what help is Russia and China going to be to the United States in enforcing UN Security Council resolutions against North Korea at this point? I mean, I don't think we can hope for much.
Mr. Colby, looking at China's strategy in the region, China lifted group travel ban to United States and South Korea, and also keeping high-level contacts with U.S. officials as well to manage its relations with South Korea and the United States. So is China's strategy in the region, somewhat on a different track from North Korea and Russia, which are just deepening relations between each other?
Well, I mean, I think they each have their own particular approach. I mean, I wouldn't exaggerate what China's doing. They didn't go to the G20, did go to the BRICS summit. By far the most significant visits that Xi Jinping has done has been with Vladimir Putin. And of course, they're sending a large delegation to I believe, the 75th anniversary of the proclamation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So I think we can see pretty clearly an alignment. I think the Chinese have been more astute and more cautious thus far about direct sort of aggressive, well, they are provoking, but at the diplomatic space, less sort of overtly belligerent. But I think it's more on a spectrum.
Ambassador Jeffrey, if Kim Jong-un actually meets with Putin and elevate the bilateral relations to the next level, how would that impact situations in Korea? Wouldn't it be more difficult to denuclearize North Korea?
Well, first of all, I don't think there's any hope to denuclearize North Korea. I would note that the very recent and very blunt national intelligence estimate that came out this summer gave 3 potential courses of action, the most likely being continued and escalating confrontation short of war on the part of North Korea. None of the 3 included North Korea giving up nuclear weapons. That is the reality we face.
And Ambassador Jeffrey, are North Korean nuclear weapons and ICBMs and missiles an asset or liability to Russia and China?
That is a very good question. Traditionally, China and Russia, while they've seen ways to exploit North Korea's confrontation with South Korea and the United States for their own advantages, also realized it was a very sensitive point for the United States, so they were very careful how far they went. They also didn't want a nuclear war breaking out. But now, with Russia's back to the wall on an existential for it conflict in Ukraine, and with the United States doing almost anything it can to stop Russia, Russia is engaging in horizontal escalation. I've seen that in the Middle East. We're seeing this with its relationship with North Korea. So therefore, I think that Russia is willing to gamble that it can somehow, with less restraint on North Korea, exploit that relationship without toppling the world or the peninsula into a conflict.
And Mr. Colby, for China, is North Korea's nuclear weapons and missiles asset or liability? There's a lot of analysis before that China is against North Korean nuclear development because it doesn't want nuclear weapons near its border.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't look at it as in the question of asset or liability, because I imagine that Beijing and Moscow both recognize exactly what Jim was saying about the National Intelligence Estimate. It's not theirs to decide, so it's a reality to be managed. I think what is clearly an asset, and they're going to increasingly, we should expect them increasingly to exploit, we already see evidence like the meeting in Vladivostok, is the power of North Korea. Obviously, its conventional military power, its ability to lash out at South Korea, Japan, and the United States itself increasingly with nuclear-armed ICBMs, and the ability to exploit that to distract the United States, to tie us down in the potential for a conflict with China, God forbid, and in those other ways. And you see that happening with other countries, with Iran, with the expansion of the BRICS, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Colby, for North Korea and Russia to deepen their bilateral ties, is it beneficial for them? Wouldn't it only highlight their illegal activities?
Yeah, but it's, not really going to matter that they're illegal, because who's going to enforce it? There's no judge, there's no police force in the international system. Look, I think if we step back, this is a very worrisome development. What we see, but it's probably inevitable at this point, what we see is bloc formation. I'm a little less optimistic about what's been going on in the U.S. policy in Asia than Jim is. I think the trilateral summit was positive. Looks like there's some forward movement, but I see a lot more optics than I do in the way of real military power. Clausewitz said, the famous German strategist that the Chinese also study, he said the best strategy is to be very strong. Right now I see a lot of meetings, I see a lot of optics, I see a lot of announcements, I see G20, I see AUKUS, etc. I see a lot less of a really sustained military buildup. The people who are focusing on a military buildup are, of course, China above all, and now Russia and North Korea are seeking to collaborate. And, John Kirby, I believe, was sort of making fun of the Russians for having to rely on North Korea, but, it's been reported that the United States has had to reach out to South Korea to help in the context of Ukraine. So we're really not in a position to judge. Now, I don't want to, this is not going to be, North Korea and Russia are sort of at the extreme. I think there's going to be a lot of fuzzy area and countries moving back and forth, like Saudi Arabia, like the United Emirates, et cetera. But I think this is what we're seeing. So it's not a moment for triumph at this point.
Ambassador Jeffrey, at the Camp David summit, United States and South Korea and Japan committed to consult when there's emergency and threat in the region, and some even compare it to mini NATO. Do you also think it was only optics and not substantial military meaning in that the latest arrangement between the three countries?
Well, as you know, there were some military steps that are good, including trilateral exercises on a more frequent basis, trilateral consultations on monitoring ballistic missile launches from North Korea, North Korean cyber activity and such, and also very gently concerning the situation in Taiwan. China was mentioned in the communique documents. So it's not an alliance, because the document also made clear that the current bilateral military alliances between the U.S., Korea, and the U.S. and Japan will continue and are still the predominant source of security. But what's so important is, and this is where I'll disagree a bit with Mr. Eldridge, is that the trilateral summit reflects almost a decade of increasing cooperation and rapprochement between Japan and South Korea. And that's for historical reasons, as your South Korean viewers know, very, very important. And that can contribute to, in the end, military and broader, as Clausewitz would also say, political containment of opposing forces. So I'm optimistic about the summit.
Now, how much, Ambassador Jeffrey, would China think it is part of that bloc with Russia and North Korea?
I was hoping you would ask that question, because in response to the comments of Mr. Eldridge, it is important to recognize that China is in a slightly different position in two areas, and this gives us something to exploit. First of all, unlike Russia, China has not burnt all of its bridges with the United States. It is basically trying, as are we in the statements from Jake Sullivan and others, de-risking our relationship, but not disengaging totally. The Chinese are pursuing a somewhat similar strategy, in part because we're still very important trading partners. But the other thing is, unlike Russia, China really is concerned about nuclear non-proliferation, not just North Korea, but South Korea, Japan, or Taiwan. All three could very quickly get nuclear weapons, and the risk of Russia unleashing North Korea against us is that will provoke such moves by other countries. So I would say focus more on China than on Russia in terms of whatever restraint we want to see on North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
I disagree with that. I think China has very clearly made the decision that it's, and you can see by the way that Xi Jinping behaves with Vladimir Putin, and of course, more importantly, their historic military buildup, which absolutely dwarfs anything that the Russians are doing. So China is clearly, and the administration has said this, it's not acting this way, but it is our primary rival, and we need to act that way. The notion that we're going to get them to meaningfully collaborate on North Korea, I think, is at this point is borderline delusional. I mean, we tried it. It didn't go anywhere. And the notion that they're going to help us solve that problem out of broad concerns from nuclear nonproliferation, I think, is belied by their behavior. And of course, they've also collaborated with Pakistan extensively. I think we have to be very, very clear. And the point is, they have not yet burned their bridges, but they are preparing to do so. Xi Jinping is preparing his people for the potential for a very real potential for conflict over Taiwan. They're practicing it. They're talking about it. They're exercising political control. They're sanction-proofing their economy. They're building up their nuclear forces. They're deepening ties with North Korea, Iran, Russia, etc. So I think this is by far the most significant and indeed acute threat now at this point.
He's got a point. First of all, I agree that by far, China is the greater long-term threat, and the administration gets the rhetoric right, if not always the action, particularly our military buildup. I still think that there is a difference in our confrontation with China today and our confrontation with Russia, which is all out. Russia has burnt all of its bridges, and it is not even trying to maintain any kind of relationship. I also think that while we cannot count on China to contribute to the denuclearization of North Korea. That horse has already left the barn, and we were disappointed by China's actions over the last 20 years. I think China, on the margins, but the margins can be important, will try to limit the flexibility of North Korea's use of the nuclear weapon threat against South Korea and against the United States. And so that is a possibility. It's not a reality, but it's something that we need to look at.
And Mr. Colby, you said China is ready to burn the bridges. To what extent do you think China will participate in the trilateral naval exercises that Russia has proposed? And if that materializes, would the confrontation between U.S., South Korea, Japan, and North Korea, China, Russia, would that full-fledged into a military escalation? Or until now, it was only at the UN Security Council, just rhetorically?
Well, they've already participated in naval exercises with the Russians. In fact, they sent a flotilla right near the Aleutian Islands. And they're sending ships through the Strait of Miyako and all around the Western Pacific and Northeast Asia. So I don't know whether they'll do this trilateral naval exercise, but I certainly wouldn't be surprised. Will this turn into a hot war? People are sort of assuming that this is going to be a Cold War. The reason, in my view, that the Cold War remained cold, except in places very sadly like Korea, was because we always assumed that it could very well become a hot war. I think there's a very serious chance. The notion that the Chinese are sort of still bought into the international system, I don't think is accurate right now. I think what we're seeing is that the Chinese are, in fact, they are actually pursuing decoupling. They have been doing so for several years through things like Made in China 2025, a dual circulation, and so forth. So I think they are no longer invested in this sort of idea of whatever the rules-based international order or something. Now, how will they act? We don't know. My own view is that their primary sort of incentives are going to be the regional military balance, their assessment of American political will in Asia, and their assessment of how things are going economically for them, including in the international context. The dangerous part there is that, and this is part of the downside of the Trilateral Summit, which again I want to stress is a positive step and does have some valuable, albeit relatively modest elements, is China believes it is being contained and suppressed. The word that Xi Jinping has used is strangled. So this is why we are seeing this. It's not whose fault it is not the issue. There is a back and forth going on in which there's a coalition forming against China's ambitions, but at the same time, China is looking for its own options, its moves with Saudi Arabia and so forth around the world. So I think we should expect a lot more collaboration, not only with Russia, but also North Korea. And they're very real possibilities. They are preparing for a war. Xi Jinping has essentially, it's a U.S. government assessment, has almost openly told the PLA to be ready for a conflict by 2027. That's not a prediction. Nobody knows, but we should certainly be ready for it.
Ambassador.
We certainly should be ready, and there's a real risk of that. But my question to you, Eldridge, is why hasn't China provided serious military equipment to Russia? There's been a few dual-use things, but believe me, whatever North Korea can provide, China can provide 100 times more, and it would be decisive in the Ukrainian conflict, and they're not doing it.
Yeah, because I think China's benefiting very greatly from the current situation, which is a war that appears headed towards protraction. China's interest is not necessarily in a decisive Russian victory. It's in tying down the United States in terms of resources, money, political capital, attention in Europe, and then paying as low a price as possible, not directly alienating the Europeans. Moreover, the Chinese are actually doing what is by far the most valuable thing for the Russians, which is propping up the Russian economy. All these sanctions people are talking about all the time, they're not working. They are having some effect, but the Russians are selling above the price cap. They are essentially having zero impact on what they are supposed to do, which is to change Moscow's strategic calculus. So from China's point of view, I understand perfectly why. And get the North Koreans, they're already in the doghouse. China wants to prepare. It's not going to do Russia favors beyond what they have to do, but they're achieving the goal, which is to tie us down and I think weaken us in Europe.
Well, is it then a U.S. interest to continue to have China not providing those weapons to Russia?
I don't think that's our primary interest. I think our primary interest is in making sure they don't see an opening to attack in the first island chain. Actually, whether or not China provides, I think this is an important point. I think whether or not China provides Russia with military equipment is less material to me than the overall state of the military balance, even on the Ukraine issue itself, but fundamentally more than anything else to make sure that they are sufficiently deterred along the first
I disagree on this because, first of all, and I have a military background as well, I believe that Chinese military support to Russia, unlike North Korean, could well be decisive in the defeat of Ukraine, which is still a real possibility. Don't believe everything you hear on TV. And that would be, in geopolitical terms, a far bigger blow to the entire U.S.-led post-1945 world order than almost anything short of a major Chinese attack in the first.
Well, let me clarify. I oppose the Chinese. I think we're right to oppose their providing military support, certainly at the scale that you're talking about. The question is, how does that rack and stack in our geopolitical rivalries? And I think that's below making sure that we have an effective deterrent along the first island chain, which I think is very much in question right now.
Sure, I agree with you. So it's priority number 2, but we're a big country, as you know, having been a government official, and we can handle 6 or 7 things at the same time.
Not well right now, unfortunately. We're not handling priority 1.
Yeah.
And Ambassador Jeffrey, bringing you back to the Korean issues, is there anything the U.S. and South Korea can do to separate China from North Korea-Russia coalition and use China to drive a wedge between North Korea and Russia?
That is actually a continuation of the discussion we've just had, focused on Korea. The only step that I would consider, and unfortunately here I agree with Eldridge that this administration is a wrong game to try to do it, would be to move towards tactical nuclear deployments in South Korea. A, that would be a counter that would get the attention of Pyongyang, but B, that would also get the attention of China, that they have to be very careful about the nuclearization of, if you will, the first island chain. And I put Korea in the first island chain. So I think that that is the step that I would contemplate. I was surprised, and we talked about this, the first submarine we sent after the U.S.-Korea declaration was an ex-strategic nuclear submarine. But then, again, to my pleasant surprise, we actually lived up to the commitment and sent one with real nuclear strategic warheads. So this administration can do these kind of things if pressured, and they need to do more.
So, Mr. Colby, the idea of using China to drive a wedge between North Korea and Russia would not be feasible.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think we tried that. It was worth a shot. But at this point, the defining feature of foreign policy, certainly as Beijing sees it, is rivalry with the United States. And I agree with Jim that we should absolutely contemplate. In fact, I think it makes a lot of sense. Deployment of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons on the peninsula and nuclear sharing arrangements would be a minimum, I would say. But I think that's the kind of direction we should be heading. The only thing, and I've said this before, I don't think the ballistic missile submarine visit to Busan is that significant because it doesn't change any of the fundamental dynamics. The actual deployment alongside Korean forces or potentially involving Korean forces in a nuclear sharing arrangement, that would be a material change.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Ambassador Jeffrey, Mr. Colby, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.